Hi, welcome to what we are calling Classic Bookmark. When we started shooting these interviews in the spring of 1988, we had no idea the show would go on for 30 years, with over 400 episodes. To celebrate and mark this achievement, we have selected 15 shows. Choosing was difficult. Most of the writers chosen, like Horton Foote and Ray Bradbury, are deceased. Others, like Toni Morrison, the Nobel Prize winner, are perfectly well, but I do not think we will be lucky enough to have them on the show again. We purposely did not include some bookmark favorites like Rick Bragg, Winston Groom, Sina Jeter Naslund, Brad Watson, Daniel Wallace, Michelle Richmond, and others, since we plan to visit with them regularly in the future. Viewers will notice that the technology has improved considerably in 30 years. We have cleaned these up the best we could. These first 30 years have been a lot of fun. I hope you enjoy watching these as much as I did making them. Anne Rice's career and her life have recently taken an unusual turn. She has moved from writing about vampires to a multi-volume fictional life of Jesus. I spoke with Anne Rice at the Alabama Booksmith in Homewood, Alabama. Miss Rice, thank you so much for coming in. I understand you're having a very, very busy 3 or 4 days in Birmingham.
I am, and I really love it here. It's great. Thank you for inviting me.
What are you doing besides being on television?
Well, I'm going to visit Temple Emmanuel by invitation today and have a chat there with Reverend Jonathan Miller. And tomorrow, Southside Baptist Church, where I'll participate in an event with Father Dunmeyer, Rabbi Miller, and Reverend Steve Jones.
I promised myself if you and I ever sat down and had a face-to-face conversation, there was a story I was going to tell you.
Okay.
25 years ago, I was teaching a little class in literary journalism. One of the assignments was for the student to contact an artist and make an appointment and get an interview. And this young man came up to me after class and he said, I want to talk to Anne Rice, but I'm sure she would never talk to me. And I said, you must try. He wrote to you, you wrote back, he went to New Orleans. You not only gave him an interview, but you gave him tea.
Oh, really? That's great.
And he came back and he was thrilled to death.
That's great.
So you have a reputation in Tuscaloosa as a very gracious, famous person.
Well, I'm glad to hear that. I really am. Great.
In those days, it was vampires and witches.
Right.
Things have changed just recently in the last book, which is, does one count this as number 27?
I think it's number 28.
28.
But I'm not sure. I actually have lost track. I've heard that I wrote 27 books, but I haven't checked myself.
I've read a few over the years, and not like this one. This one, you've moved from the world of a kind of supernatural, the vampires and the witches and those immortals, to the world of the New Testament,
right.
The world of the life of Jesus.
Right.
Now, there's a story out there in book gossip land.
Book gossip land, yes.
Well, there is
well put.
There must be such a place, right?
There is such a place, I fear.
That you suffered a terrible emotional, a catastrophe, and that as a result of that, there was a overnight, a Saul on the road to Damascus kind of overnight transformation, and you returned to the Roman Catholic Church of your childhood. Now I know, and you know,
right.
that that's not so.
No,
what
it's not.
was in fact the chronology, the process of you rejoining the church and turning to a biography of Jesus?
Well, I was very happily living in New Orleans, and I'd been there for some time. I'd been an atheist for about 30 years, and I gradually realized I was obsessed with going back to my church. I was obsessed with the possibility that I could really experience faith again and be reunited with God. And it was a gradual thing. I was reading a lot in ancient history. I was doing a lot of research about the ancient Jews, about the beginnings of Christianity, and I was really intrigued. My atheism wasn't holding up. I was losing faith in it. And of course, it was a heavy emotional factor. I was driven by an instinctive desire to go back to church, to go back to God. My conversion or my return happened before any kind of tragic event in my life or any trauma in my life at that time. Now, I had tragedy in the past, but that was in the long past.
Right.
What happened was I tore myself apart for about a year trying to answer all kinds of theological questions and questions on good and evil and social questions, and I kept thinking, I can't go back to my church. There's just too much unresolved. I don't know what I feel about these things. I mean, I had grown up Catholic, very strict Catholic, and I knew that this is an Orthodox religion. When you go back, you go back. You commit to being a Catholic again. You're a card-carrying Catholic.
They would say you never left.
Well, they would. They would indeed. But finally, one afternoon, I thought, I want to do this. I don't want to be estranged any longer from my church. And I realized I believed very much in the sacrament of the Eucharist, and I wanted to go back to the banquet table. I wanted to receive that sacrament. And so I asked my assistant, Amy Troxler, who was working for me then. Amy is a high school religion teacher. And I asked her if she knew a priest that would hear my confession. And she called back within a few minutes and said, I know the perfect person, and he's there now. And I thought, well, let's go. If he will receive me now, I'll go over there and I'll go to confession. And I went over and met Father Dennis Hayes, and I talked to him for about 2 hours. And I just laid out everything. I told him I want to go back. I want to make an act of contrition for whatever I've done. I want to return to the church. And we talked about every aspect of my life. And at the end of that, I was finished with the sacrament and was a Catholic again. And I had one obligation, that was to ask my husband of 38 years if he'd marry me in the Catholic Church. That really was a requirement. And I thought, I hope this goes well, because one could understand why a man might say, listen, we've been married 38 years, longer than almost anybody we know, but I don't want to do it. But he was not that way. He said, of course. He said, I'll do it. And the next Saturday, the next weekend, we were married in the church. And then 3 days after that, I went into a diabetic coma and nearly died. But this happened, as I said, before that happened. Right. And the diabetic coma was something I sort of missed. I mean, I woke up 48 hours later and was told, you nearly died. You were in a coma. Your blood sugar was 800. I was in the hospital, I guess, about 2 weeks, and then I came out, and as soon as I was able to go out, I went to Mass and continued to go to Mass and have ever since, really.
Yeah. I understand that you have now, at least, in the last, what shall we say, 7 or 8 years, amassed quite a library of theology and ancient history.
That's true.
But you have always done a lot of research. I mean, I understand that the clothing and the food and the wine in the Lestat books are as accurate as you
absolutely
knew how to make them.
Absolutely, and in the Witching Hour books, too.
Is that right?
Yeah.
I want to talk about that research in 2 parts. One, the kind of everyday, the physical stuff. Mm-hmm. What fun it must have been to figure out what people ate and what they ate it with, and what they wore, and where they went to the bathroom.
Exactly.
How did that go for you? What'd you learn?
Well, I attacked the first century. To do this novel about Christ, I attacked it from every conceivable angle. I read the history, Josephus, Philo of Alexandria, other historians who wrote in ancient times, and I also read all the modern scholarship I could find on archaeological discoveries, descriptions of what Jerusalem was like at that time, what the temple was like, domestic houses all over the Mediterranean. I studied lots of books on those. I had been to Pompeii, the ruins of Pompeii, a city that was destroyed in 79 A.D., and I had walked through the streets of Pompeii and spent a lot of time there, just in a few days, but long days of really going in and out of all the little houses, and I had a sense of the way people lived, what architecture was like. And I drew on all that in my memory, and I also just studied and studied and studied and read different scholars' opinions about how to interpret the data we have. And we have a lot of data about life in the first century.
So if you say they ate lentils, lentils.
I really feel that that's the case. I pretty much covered it all. It's been a little discouraging to see people off the top of their heads, so to speak, say there are inaccuracies in this book, and to mention things that are really not inaccurate at all. Not as far as I know.
In terms of theological history, which is, I think, more disputable than what size bowl people ate out of, you chose a certain number of texts that you decided. I mean, this is something that you did. Sure. You decided these were the ones that were of most use to you as a fiction writer, and also the ones that spoke to you in terms of your belief system.
Well, that's true.
And Philo especially, I think, becomes important. Who was he? Tell people who he was.
Well, Philo lived in the 1st century, and as far as we know, he never had any contact with Christ or mentioned anything about Christianity in his work. But he wrote many, many long essays about all kinds of subjects in 1st century life, and he's a very good guide to a certain kind of Jewish intellectual that flourished at that time, particularly in Alexandria. He was a Hellenistic Jew, and he wrote in Greek. And the Bible he was reading would have been the Septuagint, the Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible. And he gives us an idea of how seriously Jews took their intellectual and spiritual life at that time, and what their ideals were, and their feelings. And he also gives us a picture of what the Roman Empire was like at that time, and talks a lot about. He also talks about Pontius Pilate. He tells several incidents that happened with Pilate and how brutal Pilate was. He's very critical of him. So he's a very valuable source for all that.
Now, he's a real, indisputably historical, genuine person who lived in Alexandria.
Right.
But where the wrinkle comes for the first few chapters of your novel is that you put Jesus and his family in Alexandria with Jesus as a student of Philo.
He knew Philo. I said in the novel their lives touched, they knew of each other, but they really weren't in close contact. But I thought that was entirely logically possible. I mean, we know from the Gospels that Jesus was taken to Egypt by the Holy Family to escape Herod, who was trying to kill him. And I believe in the Gospels completely. In fact, it's more than that I believe in the Gospels. This whole novel was to be the Jesus of the Gospels. So I took those things deliberately, setting out to use them. Okay, he went to Egypt. The family hid out in Egypt for a long time until Herod was dead. One of the logical places to be would be Alexandria. That's where you'd find a large city with a huge Jewish community, a thriving Jewish community, and that's where carpenters would find work. So all of this is based on probability. He would be there. And if he was there, and Jesus was an apt pupil, which legend tells us he was, he would have come to the attention of Philo, probably.
Right. One of the things in your afterword that caught my eye, and since this is, sometimes there are questions to which you know the answer, and then sometimes there are questions to which you don't.
Right.
In this case, you mentioned that you left reading a lot of scholarship of the New Testament, especially of the Gospels and the life of Jesus, with the feeling that those scholars didn't like Jesus.
Very much so, yeah.
And again, can you say why you think that people who devoted their lives to that subject don't like the man that they were studying?
Well, there's a real tradition in New Testament scholarship that comes from the 18th century, the Age of Reason, a tradition that says we're going to examine the Gospels very dispassionately and subject them to almost scientific analysis. And the feeling, I think, among a lot of the scholars who do this is almost contempt for Jesus. They don't think he was the Son of God. They don't think there's anything to prove it. Their 18th century ideas tell them there can't be anything to prove it. So they insist on examining what they call the historical Jesus, and they feel strongly that the picture doesn't add up, that he was at best a stumblebum who just got crucified by mistake in Jerusalem, and would be horrified if somebody resurrected him and he found out what Christianity was today. And of course that idea percolates to the public in all kinds of popular books on the period. People write books all the time sort of attacking the Christian tradition and saying basically there's a lot here that doesn't add up. Well, I read the scholars who approach this, in full-dress books with a lot of documentation and so forth, and what I found was, for me, that they were writing based on bias and assumptions. I mean, their bias is as strong as our bias. If we're biased in favor of Jesus as the Son of God, their bias is that he can't be. And I didn't find anything except an arbitrary decision there. I didn't see any real proof of anything. I read a lot of their arguments and a lot of their discussion of the Gospels, a lot of their arguments that the Gospels were late documents that were written by the church or by communities. I didn't find any of this compelling. The more I examined the Gospels, and of course my approach is that of a novelist. I'm looking at a piece of writing and I'm looking at the way it coheres, I'm looking at the way it's driven, what it focuses on. The more I saw discrete, compelling documents that indicated individual authorship, coherent individual authorship throughout. Of course, there may be some lines at the end of the Gospel of John that somebody added, but not the whole Gospel of John. I mean, it didn't strike me as a document that was either created by a community or a document that was homogenized later by a panel of people. It struck me as first-person witness. And so I became critical of the skeptics, really, and I hadn't expected it to be this way. See, I thought they would have the weight of proof on their side, and that I would have to guard my faith as I went through this valley of the shadow of death, of rigorous analysis. I didn't find rigorous analysis. I found bias, I found assumptions, I found books that were highly speculative, and I also found the assurance on the part of these scholars that the audience agreed with them, and they didn't really have to prove much of anything.
Well, the burden of proof in metaphysics is hard.
Sure,
I mean,
absolutely.
and it's not theirs especially. It is ultimately the burden of proof. It sits on the shoulders of the believer.
Absolutely, it does. But I just didn't feel that they made their cases really, really well. And the bias was very obvious. I mean, I'd read a lot of history up to this point. Every novel, as you mentioned, I'd researched the background. And I'd simply never read any history where people stated their biases as strongly as they did in this field. I remember reading one book of New Testament scholarship in which the woman said the Gospel of Mark is a vicious fiction. Well, that's an unusually strident thing to say.
It's an odd thing to say.
When you're talking about an ancient document. I mean, you can say a number of things about it, but to say it's a vicious fiction is a bit much, I think, and that's from a credentialed scholar in the New Testament department. But there's a lot of that type of writing in this scholarship, and some of it is very sour, and some of it is very bitter, and a lot of it sounds angry. But what I discovered is this is a huge field, and there are many other people writing who don't write in this way at all. I kept thinking as I read the skeptics, if somebody would just apply this kind of analysis, who would just believe a little bit, what will we have, And then, of course, I discovered there were many, many scholars like Martin Hengel and N.T. Wright and Richard Buckham and John A.T. Robinson who did have great faith and who approached things nevertheless in a scholarly fashion with great bibliographies and great documentation.
It's been my good fortune over the years to be acquainted with William Styron. And in fact, he sat in that chair a while back. And one of the questions that always comes up when one is talking to Styron is the terrific amount of criticism he got for the audacity of presuming to tell the story of Nat Turner in the voice of a 19th century black slave. Well, you've gone a step further. You've gone 1900 years further. You have presumed to tell the story in the first person singular voice of a 7-year-old who's the Son of God.
That's true, I did.
Now, what kind of trepidation did you have when you decided you were going to do this first person in the voice of Jesus as a 7-year-old?
Well, I was terrified.
How's that decision-making process?
I was terrified, but nothing else interested me. The only thing that really interested me was to get as close to the character of Jesus as possible and to create a probable reality that would draw the reader in totally, so that when you read this book, no matter what your biases are, your apathy, whatever, or whatever your belief, you would come into this book and you would believe you were with Jesus and he was the Son of God and he was 7 years old. And so I set out to do it in a very deliberate way. There was no halfway for me. I mean, we don't need another pious book about Jesus, really. The whole effort I felt as a Christian artist was to get inside and get really close so that you just couldn't resist believing this when you were in the book. So I had to do it. And of course, the two novels that I've carried around all my life and studied all my life are David Copperfield and Great Expectations. And both those books by Dickens start with a boy of about 5 or 6 years old or 7 telling the story through his eyes. And I'd studied those books and studied those books and studied the way that first-person voice worked there. And I'd use Dickens as my teacher, saying to him, in essence, teach me how to use the first person, how to convey knowledge through the voice of an innocent, how to make the world open up when I look through the eyes of that child.
Dickens is perfect.
He was perfect for me.
Yeah. Trust me, although I am a normally facetious person, at the moment I'll restrain myself and say that I know how this ends.
Yes,
You have sacrificed in this project a certain amount of suspense.
That's true.
In your planning down the road towards what must be Golgotha and must be the cave, what is your strategy? What can we be looking at in terms of the balance? What are you going to get from this story to more than balance the surprise ending that we're not obviously going to have? Not exactly.
Well, this book isn't going to stop timidly at the crucifixion. It's going to go beyond the crucifixion through the resurrection and through Jesus reuniting with the apostles. And it's going to go up through the ascension into heaven, and it is going to be from Jesus' point of view. So I think it's going to offer something that's not offered very frequently in Christian art, but it's something that I can see. I have a vision of how it might have been, and I have enough nerve to go there.
Well, I believe that.
But, and I already have scenes written all along the way, that I have to pull together.
Sure.
So I'm really tremendously excited about it. And if it works right, each book should up the ante, so to speak, and each book should be more interesting than the book before it as we get deeper and deeper into what goes on. So
well, these are novels.
Exactly. And of course you can say that you don't know, that you do know the ending, but you don't really know how it's going to be done here.
No, I don't.
That's really the hook, I think.
I was interested in your strategy in this volume to withhold the manger and the Bethlehem and the slaughter of the innocents.
Right.
And withhold that because you need some kind of climax, some kind of climactic material for Volume 1.
Right.
So
and I didn't know when I started Volume 1 what that was going to be. I knew where I was going to go, but I didn't know exactly where I was going to break off or what was going to happen.
Right.
And the story began to take shape in that way. I thought, of course, Jesus is asking questions. Well, what is all this whispering about Bethlehem? That sort of happened spontaneously in the writing of the first couple of chapters, that he heard the family talking about why they couldn't go back to Bethlehem now that they were leaving Egypt, and he wanted to know, well, why? What happened? And so the novel began to flow from that. But those are the kind of things that happen in any novel to a fiction writer.
Yes.
And the hard decision was, how do I take a character who's God and who knows everything and talk about him putting aside that knowledge from himself and becoming involved with us as a human so that he finds things out gradually.
And he does.
Exactly.
He doesn't, in your work, he doesn't know everything at a conscious level at the age of 7. This is a voyage of some discovery, isn't it?
Absolutely.
Yes.
And I think the Gospels give us good reason to believe that he made that journey. I mean, we have that great scene in the Gospel of Mark where the woman with the hemorrhage touches Jesus' garment, and it says he felt the power go out of him.
Yes.
And he turned and asked, who touched me? Well, obviously, he asked the question because he didn't know at that moment. He wasn't drawing all his knowledge to himself. He wasn't every moment attempting or succeeding in knowing everything as God. He didn't want to. He came for over 33 years. There must have been a reason why he did that. He had to be involved with experience in some way. Mm-hmm. He wanted that involvement. We have Paul's statement, Jesus emptied himself for us. Well, one can say from that he emptied himself of that powerful knowledge.
Mm-hmm. A couple of collateral questions.
Sure.
Cher and Judy Garland and Madonna and you are icons of gay America.
Oh, that's where we're going. Yes.
And
Yeah, that's true.
it's
Yeah.
people tell me this,
Yeah.
and in fact, I've been asked to ask you, how do you suppose that particular segment of your fandom is going to respond? What do you hope for? What do you think is going to happen?
Well, I've found them to be very open to this book because many, many, many gay people that I know believe very much in God and in Jesus Christ, and they've been deeply hurt by being pushed away from their churches. But they care passionately about their belief, and they want to be in their communities, their faith-based communities, and they want to worship, and they want the sacraments. That's what this whole argument about gay marriage is really about. It's not just about legal marriage. It's about wanting the sacrament, to stand up before the tribe and declare your vows and to receive the approval of the community and to be received into the community. And they have more faith in the sacrament of marriage right now than heterosexuals have, by and large.
And you're on record also as believing that the Roman Catholic Church will evolve and shift its position
I think it will.
on homosexuals and on women as priests.
Oh, I do think that. Now, I don't speak for anybody when I say that. I'm just a private individual. I'm one Catholic, but I hope, I think that is happening. I mean, we are seeing a change. We've seen a huge change in the last 50, 60 years.
Yes.
I mean, when I was a child, you never heard any talk about gay people, and it was almost illegal to be gay.
Right.
I mean, that was a vastly different world. I mean, we now live in a world where almost all church communities say we must show compassion to gay people. Well, that's a huge step forward compared to the way it used to be. And we're also dealing with the reality in the Catholic Church that a great many of our clergymen are gay. And we have to ask ourselves, well, why is that? These people who are sensitive and loving and caring, and I'm not speaking about pedophiles right now. I don't
No.
think the pedophilia scandal was a gay scandal. I think it was a pedophilia scandal. It had to do with people, bad people who molested children. But apart from that, we now know that a lot of the clergy in our church are gay, and they're sensitive, caring, loving people. And we have to ask ourselves, well, what does that mean? I think we're in a learning period when it comes to gays. We're learning, just as we've learned for the last 150 years about equal rights for all people, black or white, women or men, we're learning now about gay people and straight people in that way.
Well, this has been a real treat, and I thank you again. I know that you're busy, and I know that, it was a lot of trouble to come in and give us your time, but I appreciate it.
This has been a joy. Thank you very much. I'm glad that you were interested enough. I'm glad you wanted to do it.